When we finally arrived in this small mountain town, I felt time slow down. The winter silence was so profound that the sounds of our steps in the snow seemed too loud. Around us were fog-covered peaks, old houses that looked as though they had been forgotten by someone. The windows of some houses were dim, and snowcaps had already begun to form on the roofs. Every detail of this place suggested that here, it seemed, everything had stopped. Everything was slipping through unnoticed, but remained in eternity. I finally released the tension that had built up over the past few months. The town, its nature, everything was so harmonious that I felt something inside me begin to ease. But something else still remained. Unease. Indistinct, but strong. Daniel noticed my tension, but, as always, his eyes didn't stay on me. His gaze slipped away, and in that moment, I realized that his mind was still there, in the city, at the office, among the tasks. He couldn't leave them even at this moment. "Are you tired?" I asked, trying to hide my anxiety. He simply smiled at me, but the smile was distracted, distant. "A little, but it's just the weekend. We didn't come here to work," he said, but at the same time, he took out his phone again. I stood next to him, almost like a stone, and inside, everything was tightening. I wanted to shout, "Stop! Look at us!" But I held back. Instead, gritting my teeth, I said, "I'm going for a walk. I need to stretch my legs. Stay if you want." Daniel nodded without looking up. With that step, I moved aside, leaving him in his usual company, the phone and the work that tightly held him in its grasp. In the snowy silence, I felt the air grow purer, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something important, yet unknown. We could have been something else, something more alive. But on this path, I was already standing alone. I walked along the snow-covered path, letting the cold air pass through me, trying to understand something. But the only thing I understood was that despite being here with him, I was not truly with him. And that this might have only been the beginning of something that could end. The next day, Daniel once again immersed himself in work. I couldn't wait for him to put his phone down even for a minute and look at me. But that didn't happen. His shadow became increasingly invisible, as though with every passing hour I was drifting farther away from him. But at the moment when I felt I was losing him completely, Chris appeared next to me. He was the son of Daniel's brother, a guy around 25, with an energy and liveliness that I hadn't seen in our house for a long time. It was easy to be around him because he didn't burden me with his silence, nor did he pull me into the whirlwind of endless duties and tasks. His laughter was contagious, and even when he simply sat beside me and said something simple, I could feel my soul lightening. He knew how to make me laugh, even when I didn't want to. We decided to take a walk around the town. Chris suggested we walk along the streets full of old houses hidden under snowy caps. I agreed, seeing no reason to remain in the empty silence where every glance Daniel cast at his phone only emphasized the distance between us. The street was beautiful, almost fairy tale-like. Snow fell in soft flakes, surrounding us with a gentle, silent world. We walked along old houses, their windows dim, and their roofs covered with snowcaps, as if from old paintings. Chris kept talking, laughing, and joking. He was cheerful, spontaneous, and in his presence, I began to forget what had been happening at home. At one point, I didn't notice how I stumbled and almost fell. And at that moment when I wavered, he quickly caught me and his hand firmly gripped mine. I felt the warmth of his palm and instantly froze, as if time had stopped. His fingers seemed to fill me with not only warmth, but also something new. It wasn't like before when I'd taken someone's hand out of habit or politeness. No, his touch was completely different, real, almost intimate, yet so natural that I couldn't pull my hand away. It felt as though the whole world around us had vanished, and we were here, together, and nothing else mattered. He didn't let go immediately. His hand remained in mine, and I suddenly realized I didn't want him to let go. It was a strange, almost dizzying feeling. I knew I couldn't allow myself to feel this. I was married. But for some reason, with him, at that moment, I felt more alive than I ever had before. My head was spinning, but I couldn't break free from this sensation. Chris was there, and it felt easy with him, easier than with anyone else in many years. Then, as we continued our walk, the silence that hung between us became something inevitable. We both sensed that this moment was special, that something was changing, but neither of us dared to break the silence. I felt in this silence not just Chris's presence, but his attention, his care, his strength, which seemed to call to me. It wasn't just a walk in the snow, it was a journey into a world I couldn't explain. In the evening, after returning to the cozy house, I found myself alone again. Daniel was busy. Phone, email, calls. He was consumed by work as always, and as always, he didn't notice me. I stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and felt everything inside me tighten from loneliness. He was there, but I was still alone. His absence, even in his physical presence, had become almost unbearable. At times like this, I began to wonder, had we ever been a real family? Daniel had always been there, but he was always at a distance. Recently, it seemed more and more that a wall had grown between us, an invisible but palpable one. We sat in silence at the table, each in our own world. He answered calls, and I tried not to think about how much it disappointed me. Then Chris, as always, was there. He didn't leave me alone. After dinner, he suggested we watch a movie. I agreed. It was unlikely to change anything, but at that moment, it was the only way to avoid another evening alone with the thoughts that were suffocating me. We settled on the couch, and I felt his presence growing closer. His shoulder was next to mine, his breath barely audible in the silence. It felt strange. We had never been this close, but at that moment, everything seemed natural, as though it was meant to be. I felt his leg brush against mine, and instead of pulling away, I leaned in a little. His body was next to mine, and the feeling of closeness became unbearable. It wasn't just his physical presence, it was something more, a subtle sensation that I wasn't alone, that someone noticed me. Chris leaned in a little closer, his breath brushing my skin. I didn't pull away, even though a storm was rising inside me. But his confidence, the ease with which he allowed himself to be near me, gave me strength. I felt his warmth, smelled his scent, and with every passing moment, it became harder to hide what was happening inside me. He took my hand. It was unexpected, but not as frightening as I had imagined. His fingers gently squeezed my palm, and I couldn't pull my hand away. I couldn't because, suddenly, in that touch, there was something that calmed me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. There was no rush in his gaze, no pressure. He was just there. We sat like that, the television screen flickering, but I didn't care about the movie. I felt only his presence and tried to make sense of what was happening. When his face came close to mine, I felt the air between us become dense, almost tangible. In that silence, I couldn't hide anything anymore, and suddenly, his lips touched mine. It was soft, as if the kiss was forbidden, but at the same time, irreversible. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was an inner collapse, a rejection of everything I had considered right. His kiss was both tender and full of passion, and at that moment, I forgot everything. I forgot that I was married, that this was wrong. Everything that had mattered disappeared. I felt only him, his warmth, his strength. My hand reached out to his shoulder and I realized that I couldn't stop. I sat there, motionless, as if the whole world had become completely irrelevant in that moment. Only the two of us, and nothing else mattered. At that moment, everything I felt seemed so real, so alive, that I couldn't imagine how I would live if I pulled away from it again. I sat in the darkness of my room, looking out the window at the night that had covered the town with a snowy blanket. Everything that had happened in the living room spun in my head like a scratched record, not giving me peace. His lips, his hands, every gesture that seemed so natural, as if he were a part of me. Everything felt simultaneously heightened, right, and utterly wrong. I could no longer find my footing. My heart was beating too fast, and I kept trying to understand what was happening to it. How could I have allowed that kiss? How could I have deceived myself, my family, Daniel, the man I once loved, the man I had been through so much with? I wasn't sure anymore that I was with him because of love. It became clearer and clearer to me that over the years I had simply grown accustomed. I had gotten used to his attention, to his care, but not to real closeness. We had become two strangers in the same house, both consumed by our routines. We no longer sought each other out, and I felt it in every look, every silence, every moment. But with Chris, it was different. For some reason, everything felt alive, real, even if it was strange and complicated. We had spent only a few hours together, and yet this moment, his touch, his gaze, stirred feelings in me that I couldn't explain. But was it important? Was it important what I felt? Maybe I was trying to find in him what had long since disappeared with Daniel, trying to find a way out of the dead end I had driven myself into. Suddenly, I realized I hadn't just crossed boundaries. I hadn't simply reached for another man. I had been searching for myself. I had been searching for a moment when I didn't have to be right, when I could just be alive, feeling, real. I sat in the dark, realizing that I couldn't turn everything back. With every new memory, with every feeling I had experienced with Chris, it became clearer. I hadn't felt this alive in a long time. But what about Daniel? How could I betray him like this? I tried to imagine how he would react if he knew. Maybe he wouldn't even notice how I had drifted away from him, how I had disappeared. His gaze was increasingly absorbed by something external, work, obligations. He was there, but not in the way I needed him to be. I tried to bring him back, tried to arrange a dinner, create a celebration for the two of us, but I saw only emptiness in his eyes. He was with his phone, with his computer, with his tasks, and I was here, in this snowy town, trying to find some feeling, some meaning in what I was doing. And more, it seemed to me that Chris was the one who could give me that. The creak of snow under the windows reminded me that I couldn't escape from myself. And if I allowed this to continue, I would destroy everything. But I couldn't tell myself that it was wrong. Because in that moment, when I looked at Chris, I felt like I was at a crossroads. I understood that this could become something more than just temptation, more than a mistake. It was a decision that I was afraid to make, but one that had long been ripening deep within my heart. But what was I supposed to do now? Morning brought its usual heavy emptiness. I woke up with a weight in my chest, as if the whole world was pressing down on me. Daniel was still consumed by his work, his phone, his laptop, his schedule. This was his life, and I was part of it only as a background figure. He didn't know how hard it was for me, how I was struggling to understand what was happening in my life. We had breakfast in silence, and I said something about taking a walk, hoping that at least today we could spend some time together, but his thoughts were far away. "Let's go for a walk," I said, trying to bring at least a little warmth into this lifeless atmosphere. He nodded without looking up, continuing to stare at his phone screen. His hand brushed across his coffee cup, and at that moment, I felt all the energy drain from our conversation. He didn't hear me, didn't see me. We walked together, but every step felt like part of the same empty routine. Daniel answered calls, absent-mindedly commenting on something. I tried to catch his gaze, but his attention was scattered. I could feel the disappointment growing in my chest, turning into a bitter drop that spread throughout my body. "You don't even want to try, do you?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice from cracking into a shout. He stopped, looked at me with confusion, but immediately returned to his phone. "You know I have commitments," he answered coldly, and I felt something break inside me. He was here, but he wasn't. He was here physically, but he wasn't with me. I felt my eyes fill with tears, but I held them back. I couldn't allow myself to be weak anymore, but despite that, I couldn't shake the thought that everything I had once wanted wasn't real. All these years with Daniel, none of it was what I'd been searching for. I understood this, But how could I admit it out loud? How could I tell myself that I didn't love him the way I used to? The more I tried to talk to him, the more he withdrew into himself. Every glance he cast at his phone felt like a blow, a reminder that I was doing everything wrong. I had tried to be the woman he could be proud of, but was I really that woman for him? He seemed so distant, so foreign, and I began to feel how, with each passing day, more and more sounds and images in our home became strangers to me. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore and returned home alone, leaving Daniel in his world. I tried not to think about what had happened with Chris that night, but thoughts of him wouldn't let me go. I tried to push them away, but they came back with greater force. Chris, young, vibrant, alive. He wasn't the one hiding behind screens and reports. He was there. He was real, and his gaze, his words, his touch, everything became what I had been searching for. The more I tried to be close to Daniel, the more distant he became. In his eyes, there was no interest, no sign of what had once made me feel loved. And as I looked around our home, which had once been full of life and laughter, it became clear that I could no longer turn everything back. We had both become strangers, and I didn't know what to do with that. And at that moment, Chris was there. His presence filled the emptiness that had filled our home. I could no longer hide my feelings. In the evening after I returned home, the emptiness enveloped me once again. Daniel was still consumed by his work, his attention fixed on the phone screen, and I, just as always, was left alone in this house. My steps grew quieter, and my thoughts more confused and tangled. But then he appeared again. Chris. He came to help with dinner, and I felt his presence in this house becoming inevitable. He was like a light in a dark room, where everything else disappeared like sounds behind a wall. In his gaze, I saw something familiar, the very spark I hadn't seen in life for so long. And although I tried to keep my distance, every gesture, every word from him made me forget that I should be cautious. Chris was nearby, helping to chop vegetables, serving plates. His movements were confident, precise, and I noticed how he looked at me. It wasn't the look of a man simply helping a woman. It was a look full of attention, interest, and something much more that I couldn't ignore. I could feel his presence filling the room, his proximity becoming more and more tangible. Every step he took seemed closer, and I couldn't stop it. When I turned to grab something from the shelf, I unexpectedly felt his hand brush mine. It was accidental, but in that moment, nothing felt accidental. I felt my heart miss a beat. His fingers softly, almost imperceptibly, touched my skin, and I froze. I didn't pull away. I just stood there, unable to look away, feeling something inside me begin to ignite. I looked at him, and he looked at me as if every moment mattered. His eyes were full of that very spark I was beginning to feel inside myself. It was excitement. It was attraction, something I couldn't, and didn't want to, ignore. He whispered, "You know I'm always here, right?" His voice was soft but full of meaning. I felt everything tighten in my chest. What could I answer? What could I say to him when my soul screamed, "Yes, I know"? But all I managed to squeeze out was a barely audible, "I know." In his gaze was not only confidence but also an understanding that I could no longer hide. We both knew there was something more between us, and I felt how this moment slowly consumed me. All my caution, all my attempts to keep a distance disappeared, melting away like snow under the sun's rays. Then, when I turned back to continue cooking, his hand touched mine. But now it didn't pull away. It stayed. His fingers entwined with mine, and I didn't pull my hand away. I felt his warmth seep into me, making me forget everything. His gaze became even more insistent. He was there, and there was no way to escape him. We stood like that for a few seconds, but it felt like entire years passed. I wanted to push him away, to return to my usual life, but something inside me wouldn't let me take that step. This moment was too strong to simply leave behind. I felt how his gaze filled me with not only desire, but also deep attachment. It was more than just attraction. It was something that couldn't be stopped. When he stepped closer again, I knew this was only the beginning. We were standing on the edge, and taking a step back was impossible, and I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing. Everything that was happening was inevitable. I tried to find some support, something that would remind me of what had been before, of what I had once loved, of what had mattered when Daniel and I were on the same wavelength. I was preparing dinner, decorating the table with candles, trying to create an atmosphere that could bring back even a shadow of what we once had. This was my last chance. I knew that if I didn't do this now, I would never be able to. I chose his favorite wine, picked dishes he always loved. As I finished setting the table, I felt my hands trembling. Everything I was doing was aimed at regaining his attention, bringing back his gaze, bringing him back here, to me. I hoped that this evening would be the moment when everything would change, when we would be closer to each other again. Daniel came home late, absorbed in yet another task. He walked into the house without noticing either the dinner, the decorations, or me. He didn't even look at me, didn't pay attention to the atmosphere I had carefully created. He was, as always, lost in his phone, his important tasks, the things I could no longer understand. He just walked past, not asking what I had cooked, not looking into my eyes.